Hey everyone, welcome back for another deep dive. And let's be honest, when you hear the name Nebuchadnezzar, you probably think of that Babylonian king from the Bible, the Hanging Gardens, all that.
Right. Nebuchadnezzar the second.
Exactly. But today we're going back even further to an earlier Nebuchadnezzar the First. And for our source material, good old Wikipedia. But don't worry, we're going way beyond those dry as dust textbook entries.
Absolutely. And it's interesting you say going beyond, because even the name Nebuchadnezzar itself is more complex than it seems. It's
Yeah.
actually the Hebrew form of his name, not what he would have been called back in his day. Around 1100 BC, it really shows you how history is interpreted and how these stories get retold over time.
Yeah, wow. Already a new perspective, and we're just getting started. So paint us a picture. Who is this guy?
So Nebuchadnezzar was the fourth king of the second dynasty of Isin. Now that's a different dynasty than the more famous Nebuchadnezzar. And he ruled Babylon for about 22 years, which might not sound like a super long time, but in those days, it was pretty impressive to hold on to power for that long. It really meant something. And in fact, he's actually considered to be the most important ruler from that whole dynasty.
Okay, so a major player in ancient Babylon. What makes this Nebuchadnezzar someone we should deep dive on?
Well, he definitely knew how to craft his image, much like leaders throughout history have done. And there's this really amazing story, this legend. It's called the Enmeduranki legend, and it links him to this lineage of kings going all the way back to before Great Flood.
Whoa, okay, hold on. Talk about a power move.
Right.
Even today, claiming that kind of ancestry is a big deal. But back then, it must have been huge.
Huge, yeah, exactly. And the legend itself is pretty wild. It starts by describing Babylon in this state of utter chaos. Crime everywhere, the gods have seemingly abandoned them, total societal collapse.
Yikes. Doesn't sound like a great time to be alive.
No, not at all. And the language they use is really vivid. It talks about evil demons filling the land, and the land itself diminishing. And then to make matters even worse, they throw in this wicked Elamite into the mix, adding this external threat on top of all the internal chaos.
Oh, so they're really setting the stage here. Sounds like they're getting ready to introduce a hero, which I'm guessing is where Nebuchadnezzar I comes in.
You got it. This whole legend is really crafting this image of him as a savior, this guy who is destined to restore order, someone who is practically born to rule.
Okay, so let's talk about this so-called wicked Elamite then. Who were they?
So the Elamites were a powerful kingdom in their own right, and they were constantly vying for control of this region. You could say they were Babylon's biggest rival at the time.
Okay, so not just some random bad guy in the story. This was a real threat, which I guess makes the whole rivalry that much more intense. What do we know about how their conflicts actually played out?
Well, they were locked in this constant struggle for dominance, with battles that really shaped the entire political landscape. And, we often imagine these like single decisive battles, but in reality, Nebuchadnezzar's victory over Elam, it was the result of a whole series of different conflicts.
Oh, so a real long game of strategy and power plays. Did he always have the upper hand, though?
Well, not always. There were definitely some setbacks along the way, moments of uncertainty. In fact, there's one account that describes how his army was actually ravaged by a plague
Hmm.
early on in his reign. Imagine that, just terrible luck.
Oh, wow. Talk about bad luck, right? And I guess a good reminder that even these legendary figures still had to deal with very real challenges.
Exactly. But this is where it gets really interesting. There's this thing called a kuduru, which is essentially an inscribed stone document. And it describes this daring raid led by Nebuchadnezzar I against the Elamites.
Hold on, hold on. A kuduru, what is that? Like a giant stone tablet with all the ancient gossip. What does it say about the raid?
Pretty much. Think of it as their version of like a written record. And this kuduru in particular, it describes how Nebuchadnezzar launched this surprise attack. And get this, during the most brutal part of summer, like scorching hot. It even says that the axes, held in the hand, burned like fire, and the road surfaces were scorching like flame.
Oh, wow. Talk about commitment. I can barely handle getting into a hot car, let alone marching into battle in that kind of heat.
Right. But that was part of his strategy. I mean, the Elamites would never expect an attack in those conditions, and it worked. He completely routed them. And while he didn't manage to actually sack their capital city, Susa, he did manage to get his hands on something. That was arguably even more valuable.
Okay, now you've got me on the edge of my seat. What could possibly be more valuable than a whole capital city?
Remember we were talking about Marduk, the patron god of Babylon.
Oh, right, right. The one who kind of abandoned them when things got rough.
Yeah, well, it turns out the Elamites had actually captured a statue of Marduk sometime before, which would have been a huge blow to the Babylonians, not just religiously, but symbolically as well.
Yeah, I can imagine. It'd be like stealing a nation's most prized possession. I bet that didn't go over very well.
Not at all. But after defeating the Elamites, Nebuchadnezzar, I was actually able to reclaim the statue and return it back to Babylon.
Oh, wow. Okay, so this wasn't just about like loot or territorial gain. This was about restoring something sacred, something that was deeply meaningful to the Babylonian people.
Exactly. It would have been a huge morale boost for Babylon.
Yeah.
A sign that the gods were back on their side. And then for the Elamites, losing that symbol of their victory, that would have been devastating. It really shows how Nebuchadnezzar, I wasn't just a military victor, he was also the restorer of their pride. And this one act really fed into that whole savior king image from the Enmedaranki legend.
Wow, talk about understanding your audience. He was playing the long game with his legacy in mind. But I'm guessing his reign wasn't all war stories, right? I mean, he must have done other kingly things too.
Oh, absolutely. You're right. While he's definitely very well known for his military victories, Nebuchadnezzar's reign was also marked by these really ambitious building projects, like, for example, the temple that he dedicated to the god Adad in Babylon. And here's where it gets even more interesting. We also have all these economic texts that survived from his time.
Whoa, really? Like what? Ancient receipts. What did they buy in bulk back then? Was it grain, sheep, chariot wheels?
Not quite receipts, but these records give us this fascinating glimpse into the everyday workings of Babylonian society, like what they traded, what they valued, how they organized their economy.
Wow, that's fascinating. So we get to see beyond the battlefield and get a peek into the day-to-day lives of the people living in his kingdom.
Yeah, exactly. And there's more. We also have something called the Uruk list of sages and scholars. And it not only mentions Nebuchadnezzar as being a patron of learning.
So he was into knowledge bombs, even back then. I knew there was a reason we were drawn to this guy. What kind of knowledge was he into?
So this list is incredible and names all these different people who were experts in all sorts of fields: astronomy, medicine, even literature and mathematics. It really shows how Nebuchadnezzar I supported the intellectual life of Babylon, not just its military defenses.
So he understood that a strong civilization needs more than just like a strong army. It needs thinkers, innovators. Man, that makes his reign even more interesting than just like a series of battles.
He really does. And it challenges that traditional image that we have of a warrior king. He clearly understood the power of knowledge, the power of culture. In fact, there's even some debate about whether one of those famous Babylonian works of literature, this epic poem called the Enuma Eliah, might actually be from his time.
Wait, the Enuma Eliah, that's the one about how the world began, right?
Right. That's the one. Full of gods and monsters, epic battles, the creation of humanity. Now, we don't know for sure when it was written, but some scholars believe that it could have originated during Nebuchadnezzar I's reign.
Wow, okay. That's huge. I mean, if that's true, it adds a whole other layer to his legacy. It's not just about restoring a city anymore. It's potentially about, like, overseeing the creation of their foundational myths, their stories.
Exactly. It really makes you wonder about the discussions. That must have been happening in his court. The ideas being debated, the knowledge being explored during that time.
Yeah, it definitely paints a different picture than what we might typically expect. From a king ruling over 3,000 years ago, it sounds like Nebuchadnezzar I, was very intentional about the legacy he wanted to leave behind.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, think back to that Enmedaranki legend, that carefully crafted narrative, positioning himself as the savior king. And then we see him retrieving that statue of Marduk, another powerful symbol for the Babylonians.
Right, right. It's like he understood the importance of symbolism, the way that it can shape public perception. And, I mean, isn't that something we still see today? Leaders use speeches, imagery, even social media to craft their image.
Exactly. Nebuchadnezzar, I might not have had Twitter, but he knew how to use the tools of his time to influence how he would be remembered.
It's amazing how these themes of power, image, legacy, how they still resonate with us today. It makes history feel a lot more relevant, don't you think?
Absolutely. These stories from thousands of years ago, they still have something to teach us about leadership, about how narratives are shaped, and how cultures value and protect their own heritage.
Yeah, and speaking of cultural heritage, that story about Marduk's statue was pretty powerful. It was clearly so important to them, not just as like a religious artifact, but as a symbol of their pride, their identity.
Absolutely. And it's something that we still see today. Think about artifacts that have been looted, taken from their rightful places throughout history, the fight to repatriate them, the significance that's attached to them. It speaks to something very fundamental. about our connection to the past.
Yeah, it's like holding on to those objects is a way of holding on to a part of yourself, a part of your history.
It's this tangible link to the past, this reminder of where we come from. And the fact that Nebuchadnezzar, I understood that.
Well,
He understood the power of that act, reclaiming that statue, restoring it to its rightful place. It speaks volumes about how well he understood his people and their values.
it really makes you think, if a statue could be that powerful back then, what symbols hold that same kind of weight in our world today?
That's a great question. It's definitely something worth thinking about. What do we consider sacred? What stories do we tell about ourselves, about our past, whose voices are amplified and whose voices are silenced? It's a thread that connects us all the way back to ancient Babylon.
It really is amazing how these stories from thousands of years ago can still spark such relevant conversations today. Nebuchadnezzar I, this king from ancient Babylon, suddenly feels very contemporary.
He does, doesn't he? And I think it's a testament to the enduring power of history. When we dig into these stories, we uncover not just the facts and the dates, but these really incredible insights into human nature, ambition, the ways we shape our own narratives.
It's a good reminder that history isn't just something that we read about in textbooks. It's a living, breathing thing that continues to influence us today, even in ways that we might not realize.
Absolutely. And who knows what other mysteries and insights are still waiting to be unearthed, maybe even from a Wikipedia entry about a king named Nebuchadnezzar.
That's the beauty of a good deep dive, right? You never know where it might lead you. Thanks for joining us on this journey back to ancient Babylon, and be sure to check back soon for another fascinating deep dive.